It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, January 10th, 2025. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. We are both not evacuated. We are both monitoring the circumstances here on the ground. Sam, this is, just as a native Californian, the worst fire I can recall in Los Angeles, not only having lived here for 25 years, but just being aware of Los Angeles as a place. I've never had fires this so far into the actual city, at least in my memory.
No, nor I. I mean, I've lived here for almost 20 years myself, and there's nothing I've seen like this. Although we're certainly no strangers to fire here in the
Right.
City of Angels.
No, it just tends to be a little more peripheral on the outlying
Yes.
areas where this
Yes.
is in the city. But it is not so bad that we cannot talk about Canada and Austria and the death of Jean-Marie Le Pen. Let us begin with Canada. Now, you said, Sam, again, we're peeling back the curtain here, 2 weeks in a row. You said Canada, Austria, and Le Pen. Now, if you Google, like any diligent journalist, Google Canada, the news is littered with this absurd, frankly, baseless, fruitless, pointless rhetorical exercise about President-elect or from President-elect Trump talking about how he's trying to make Canada the 51st state. That, of course, is not what we're talking about. Just
No, but I'm
make
glad
that very
you brought,
clear.
I'm glad you brought that up, though, because in those same sort of batch of utterances from the president-elect, I just want to let our listeners know that we're not going to talk about Canada becoming the 51st state, and we're also not going to talk about the United States annexing Greenland, and we're not going to talk about the United States regaining possession of the Panama Canal, or for that matter, renaming the Gulf of Mexico. If any actual steps are taken by the Trump administration after Donald Trump is sworn in as president, then we will talk about these things. Until such time as that, though, we will not. And so I just want to, if this is a big disappointment to people, then I apologize for that. Well, we're going to talk about stuff that's actually happening. So, John, what are we going to talk about in reference to Canada?
Well, we're going to talk about the resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. According to Wikipedia, he announced separately as resigning as Prime Minister and as the leader of the Liberal Party, as announced earlier this week on January 6th. Trudeau was appointed Prime Minister back in 2015. It's been a long time and has been facing a heavy decline in public opinion polling and has been gradually losing the confidence of the House of Commons and Liberal Party members. Leading up to the 2025 federal election. A month before Trudeau announced his pending resignation, he had the second lowest approval rating in Canadian history. He is the ninth prime minister in Canadian history to announce his pending resignation, not as a result of losing an election. And the Conservative Party leader is a guy named Pierre Poilievre. And
okay, now in French, it's Poilievre. But
Poilievre.
But okay. I've heard English-speaking Canadians just say Poilievre, basically, right? Yeah, and so there's
Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah,
how about that?
It's controversial in Canada actually as to how much French you should know how to speak.
Right. This is a culturally culturally sensitive,
and I don't think Poilievre himself is actually all that picky about how people pronounce his name, so we shouldn't be either.
Okay, but I was wrong on Poilievre. It's Pierre Poilievre.
It's Poilievre.
Poilievre.
Yeah.
Pierre Poilievre. He's a 45-year-old Conservative Party leader. BBC reports that when he was 20 years old, he laid out a low-tax, small government vision for the country in an essay contest about what he would do as prime minister. BBC also says for months, Poilievre's Conservatives have enjoyed a large lead over the struggling Liberals in national surveys, suggesting they would win a majority government if an election were held today. The election is likely to be called soon.
Yes.
Poilievre is promising a return to, quote, common sense politics. Sam, what to make of Canada? Who I feel like the Canadians, who we love, have gotten relatively scant attention. on working for Crusoe?
That's true. We don't end up talking about them all that often. Well, not, I mean,
Because
not
they're well run?
generally, yes. Although, I mean, Trudeau's unpopularity is not for no reason. And, my sister is Canadian, so I have a deep affection
Of
for
course.
Canada and all its people. But he's become just massively unpopular. And to be fair, it's not unrelated to his relationship to the president-elect, as
Mm.
we'll see. But that's not the only problem. Since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation has been a big problem in Canada, just as it has everywhere in the industrialized world and even in some non-industrialized countries. And Canada has been no exception.
Right.
Uh,
He's the incumbent. Liberals are the incumbent party.
Absolutely. And so it shouldn't be at all surprising that any incumbent party is unpopular. But people in Canada have also developed a great deal of antipathy towards Trudeau, almost on a personal level. They're just tired of him. And he has made a number of mistakes. He's dismissed a number of his cabinet ministers or had some of them resign. And actually, an unusually large number of them have been female, including most recently, last month, Chrystia Freeland,
Mm.
who was at his right hand throughout his political career. Other people came and went, but Chrystia Freeland was always there. She was, I think, at the end was the finance minister, but she had previously been the foreign minister as well as the deputy prime minister. And so she was actually supposed to be presenting her budget for the coming year, but instead resigned with no small amount of bitter recriminations against Trudeau himself. And so this was basically sort of the last straw, excuse me. If Trudeau had lost the support of Chrystia Freeland, then basically he pretty much had to resign because everybody else had already turned against him. And just as a media note, prior to her involvement in government, Chrystia Freeland was a very widely respected economic and financial journalist. She worked for Reuters. She worked for The Economist. She worked for the Financial Times. And this gave her a fair amount of gravitas inside the government, especially in her final post as finance minister.
Speaking of the media, our media colleague and personal favorite of yours, Sam, David Frum, pointed out that there does seem to be a time limit on any Canadian premiership or government, rather, no matter how popular they may be. It's about 10 years. And that's kind of also true in the UK, right?
Sure. I mean, it's a little longer there, but I think it's true
Hmm.
of just about any democratically elected government. People just get tired. And, Trudeau, I mean, there's other things about him. He's certainly a very well-spoken, intelligent fellow, right? But he's also a pretty boy nepo baby, right? His father was the prime minister, and after a while, that's annoying just out of the box, right? After a while, it's really kind of a bit much. Uh, but as far as issues go, another big problem that they're having in Canada, I would say possibly even worse than it is here, although it's certainly bad here, is housing.
Now, how
Because
does that happen? Canada's well run. There's not oceans of red tape like you get in California or New York City. Canadians, these are common sense people, cheerful, friendly, and informed. We know the national characteristics. How has housing with all that open space become such a problem?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons, anyway, is that unlike many other Western countries, Canada has, until very recently, had a very open and welcoming and, as you say, streamlined and well run immigration policy. The number of immigrants that have been coming into Canada from all over the world, especially during the government of Trudeau, has been very, very large. And up until very recently, it's been no problem, except that housing has not kept up with the influx of new people. Housing doesn't, houses take a while to build. You have to plan for them, and make sure you've got everything all set up. And especially, like in many countries, immigrants tend to go toward large cities
Sure.
more so than towards rural areas. And so it can be more challenging to build in large cities. And so housing prices have gone up very dramatically in
Vancouver, notoriously expensive,
yes,
for
Toronto as
example.
well, right? And so this is a big problem because there's no inflation like housing inflation. I mean, you can feel it right away. And again, this is something that's become a very big problem recently in Canada, and one that Trudeau didn't seem to have any idea of what to do about. For instance, one of the issues that caused Chrystia Freeland to resign was that Trudeau was talking about a tax holiday, right, to help people deal with rising costs of living, and also a stimulus program. And that's, here's some money to help you pay for stuff, right? But the problem with things like that is that they're inflationary, right? They will make inflation worse. And so this is just, and that, especially somebody like Chrystia Freeland with her deep knowledge of economics, she couldn't stick with that, right? I mean, she's like, no, that's absolutely a terrible idea, right? And so she quit, and it was only within a few days that Trudeau decided that he would also resign, just as everybody predicted he would after Freeland quit.
Canada's a country of 41 million people. This is the 16th biggest economy in the world. Um, it is kind of remarkable. They fly so under the radar generally. I mean, they're a great trading partner with the United States.
Yes.
Um, I mean, it is odd. I'm trying to think about. I wasn't paying nearly as close attention as I am now to international affairs when Trudeau came to power in 2015. To be honest, reading about him being in power for 10 years, it struck me. I didn't quite realize it had been so long. And again, that's just because, again, from the myopic United States, it's just kind of been humming along up to the north.
Well, yes. I mean, they have a sizable military for a country of the size of their population, but there's about the same number of people in Canada as there are in California,
Yeah,
right? So it's not a large population. They're a great trading partner of ours, and with many other countries also. But they're not exactly an economic powerhouse.
sure.
They're just sort of a mid-sized country. They do fine, right? So there's not a whole lot of reason that we should, they're not in the European Union, so they're not involved in any of the messy negotiations with the European Union. The only time they ever make the news is when Donald Trump decides that he's mad at them, right? So during the Biden administration, there really hasn't been a whole lot going on with Canada, but it seems like there's going to be.
It's not going to happen. And I said we weren't going to talk about it, but just from a pure political standpoint, if Canada did become the 51st state, it would certainly not go for Trump. It would be a blue state
Well, I mean,
with a lot of electoral votes.
well, first of all, yeah, they'd have probably about 50 or so seats in the House, right?
Yeah,
And two senators, but not all of them would be Democrats, John,
sure,
right? They might be relatively evenly divided. I think it'd probably be more of them would be Democrats, but it wouldn't be
sure.
a blowout, I don't think, right? But I'll tell you
Well,
one
again,
thing.
we shouldn't be talking about it at all, but it's so absurd when you start to peel away the layers. It gets even more absurd.
Well, one thing I will tell you is that one thing that uh, Canadians really like is government provided health care.
Yeah.
So, if you want to import 40 million people who all really like government provided health care, yeah, you go right ahead and do that. But
Yeah.
again, this is absurd. And so we shouldn't really be talking about it.
Okay.
But one thing, before we move on,
Please.
I think one of the things that makes Poilievre and just the Conservative Party in general more appealing is that Trudeau has often had contentious relationships with Trump. And so Canadians figured, look, let's just get somebody else who Trump isn't going to hate out of the box. And if it's a conservative guy, then maybe, he'll be able to do a better job getting along with Trump, which makes a certain amount of sense,
Of course
right?
it does.
Well,
It's just
Poilievre is not as crude or crass as Trump, but he is a very combative sort of right-wing figure for Canada, right? Not by our standards, but by Canadian standards, he would be.
yes, he used scathing rhetoric calling Trudeau's government and policies quote authoritarian socialism.
Yes, I thought that was eyebrow raising. Yes.
Yeah.
But even he says, no, this idea of becoming the state, it's ridiculous, right? He has no intention of any such thing happening. And frankly, nobody else does either.
No. Again, every country, including our own great republic, is allowed to elect any bozo they want.
Yes.
It's vexing that it has such an outsized impact on other countries and other
Yes.
people.
I agree with you 100%.
All right. So from absurdist Canadian news to far right government in Austria. What could
Yes,
possibly go?
From one conservative politician to another.
Yeah. Reuters, Dateline Vienna. This is from, we're recording this Thursday evening. This is from January 9th, Thursday. Talks to form a coalition government led by Austria's far-right Freedom Party, the FPO, will begin on Friday. That is the 10th of January when this is published. According to the FPO, as thousands protested in Vienna against the prospect of the country's first FPO-led government. The FPO is Eurosceptic and Russia-friendly, and they won September's parliamentary election with around 29% of the vote, but was initially sidelined as centrist parties tried to form a ruling coalition without it. Because if history tells us anything, it's to be cautious about your far-right Austrians. Now that's my insertion. Back to Reuters. That effort failed at the weekend, and FPO leader Herbert Kickl, Sam?
Yes, Kickl.
Was tasked with forming a government. Kickl, quote, first step, negotiations on the budget as of tomorrow. While protesters carrying placards reading Nazis out and history is repeating itself gathered in the square that stands between the offices of the president and the chancellor. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, Sam.
I guess
Nazis out.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, far-right Austrians.
Oh, well,
the floor is yours.
To be fair, all right, the FPO is one of the oldest extant far-right parties in all of Europe. They actually started out.
Is that supposed to assuage my concerns?
No, not at all. Oh. What I'm saying is they're not some new jack party like, the AFD or something like this.
Okay,
or the Brothers of Italy in Italy of all places.
Right.
Again, in the 1950s, this is shortly after the war. They were, even
more.
Wow,
FPO is that old?
Yes.
Fascism had just gone down to defeat.
Yeah,
the
no,
worst
they had almost no support at all, but they do date back that far, and they were, if anything, more explicitly Nazi than they are now. And so when these people have signs saying Nazis out, they're not joking, right? I mean, this is actually where this party comes from.
That's bananas. Until this very moment, I had no idea there was a Nazi renaissance anywhere in Europe in the 1950s. I mean,
keep in mind, Austria is a very small country.
Sure.
And
they were a fringe party. I get it, but still.
Yeah, and nobody really cares a lot what happens there, right? Or hasn't in 100 years, right? That is domestic.
Austria is for composers.
Yeah, but they are, as I say, a very long-standing party, and they've served in the government before for at least, I think, about 20 years in on and off, right? It's just that they've never actually been tasked with
in charge,
leading a government before, and to be fair, they haven't actually succeeded in leading one yet, right? They've just been asked to form a government, and they hope to be able to do so.
Sam, I mean, as listeners will know, I often immediately kind of leap to the historical perspective. I don't know if either of us will live long enough for there to be the long kind of overarching explanation for why this moment in history has seen such a resurgence in national populism and far right. I mean, the notion that 29% of Austrians voted for like the next generation Nazis is crazy.
Well, I mean, yeah, they only lost.
I know inflation's bad, but
Well, but again, the FPO, it's not like they've come out of nowhere. They've been around in Austria and they've been in the government before. It's not like it's some new phenomenon for them, right? It seems shocking.
And they didn't destroy the democratic process.
That's right, by serving
means,
in the government.
Actual Nazis did. Okay, so I mean, I guess there's credibility that they're maybe not as monstrous.
Well, I mean, that they would certainly like us to think so,
Sure.
but people have every right to be alarmed. I think they really should be. But again, Austria is a very small country and not very influential. But as we've noted, this is just another part of not just the anti-incumbent wave that has swept the world all through last year, but quite a lot of the victorious challenging parties have been right-wing parties. Not all of them, but it would seem to be an alarmingly high proportion of them are on the far right. And we'll see this play out throughout this year also with elections coming up in Germany, especially just next door to Austria, and perhaps even in France. It's again, and perhaps the Conservative Party will be victorious in Canada, as we've just discussed, although they're not a far right party, but by any stretch of the imagination, resembling the FPO. But we talked about the Austrian election back when it happened, very briefly, just because it was inconclusive, and the mainstream parties tried to form a government amongst themselves for 3 months and failed. So the then incumbent party, the center-right party, and what are they called, John?
They are the Conservative People's Party.
The People's Party,
Yeah,
John.
OVP is
That's
their.
right, the Austrian People's Party. And so they couldn't form a government, and so there was no choice. But the actually ceremonial president, who was from the Green Party, was left with no choice but to ask the Freedom Party to form a government.
Wait, so that's not Chancellor Karl Nehammer. He's with the Conservative People's Party. He had
Yes.
led the centrist coalition talks.
Correct.
Okay. This is Reuters said on Saturday he was stepping down because the talks had collapsed. His successor as head of the caretaker government, Foreign Minister Alexander Schallenberg, is due to take over Friday, the day
Yes,
it
as a
publishes,
caretaker.
tomorrow morning.
We'll have to see. They might not even succeed in forming a government, and then I think I'm not certain about this, but I think they would have to have a whole new set of elections, and that would be lots of fun, wouldn't it, John?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not up to speed on the Austrian constitution, so this will be a good.
Well, just as far as the nomenclature goes, the Chancellor of Austria is what we would call
the president.
Prime Minister, just like in.
Excuse me, Chancellor is the Prime Minister, not
Yes,
the
just like
president.
in Germany, right? Olaf Scholz is the Chancellor of Germany, but the job is analogous to Prime Minister in other European countries, such as Italy, for example.
All right, I've always wanted to say this, Sam. Speaking of Nazis, Jean-Louis Marie Le Pen died on January 7th. So that's Tuesday of this week. Jean-Marie Le Pen was 96. This is from Wikipedia. He was a French far-right politician. He focused on issues related to immigration to France, the European Union, traditional culture and values, law and order, and France's high rate of unemployment. His progression in the 1980s is known as, quote, the Le Penization of minds, due to its noticeable effect on mainstream political opinion. Le Pen's controversial speeches and his integration into public life made him a figure who polarized opinion. He was convicted of statements downplaying the Holocaust and fined for incitement to discrimination regarding remarks made about Muslims in France. His longevity in politics and his 5 attempts to become president of France made him a major figure in French political life. The big story was he unexpectedly got to the second round of the 2002 presidential election, and then he was beaten in a landslide by incumbent Jacques Chirac. In fact, that beating was so bad. Did you know this, Sam? According to Wikipedia, the 21st of April is now a frequently used expression in France, as in you got beat badly. It's the real 21st of April or whatever.
I didn't know that at all.
Yeah. Well,
That's
Wikipedia
funny.
says so. It must be true.
It must be true.
And of course, his daughter is Marie Le Pen, who fired him from kind of the rebranded
Yes.
National Front. What are they now?
The National Rally.
The National Rally. That's right.
Rassemblement
Yeah.
National, as
National.
opposed to the Front
Yeah.
National.
Thank you. So she fired her dad because he was not a kinder, gentler French Nazi, basically.
That's right. And it's really his daughter, Marine, who has rehabilitated the party and turned them into a pretty mainstream political party in France. Shunting aside the traditional center-right party, who are not called the People's Party, but
Right.
are now called the Républicains, and formerly, as we've talked about, the UMP, or the Party for a United Movement. And so, but it was Le Pen père who really put the National Front slash rally on the map, right? He built it up from nothing in the 70s to the point where he actually made it to the second round of the presidential election. Yes, he got crushed, but just the idea that he could make it to the second round at all was scandalizing. And it almost spelled the end of the traditional center left party, the Socialist Party in France, who since then, that is, since 2002, has only served one term in the presidency. And they're still a formidable bloc in parliament, but nothing like they used to be. And of course, the current president, Emmanuel Macron, has, if anything, by leaving the Socialist Party and starting his own party, even further hastened the decline of the Socialist Party in France, leaving us with this really awkward and unmanageable three-way right, left, center situation that obtains in France right now, and we'll have to see how long it can last.
Just so folks don't think this is two California liberals calling any garden variety French right winger a Nazi, Le Pen actually led efforts in his lifetime to rehabilitate the reputation of collaborationist Vichy French,
Yes.
who played ball with the original Nazis during their occupation of France in the Second World War. And he took shots at Charles de Gaulle, saying, "Oh, it must have been easy to resist from London." Like, he's a shocking figure. He lived to be 96. He was
That's
shocking
right.
people for decades.
That's
I
right.
mean, France was brutally occupied.
Okay.
It's well known. It's crazy that he had this level of buoyancy politically.
Well,
I mean, look, there was a right wing in France before the war. I understand that.
Yes.
There's always has existed in France. I do know that. But
okay. I find it less shocking than you do. I think that it's more, for French people, it's more sort of secretly embarrassing, right? Because there were plenty of people in France leading up to and during the war who you didn't have to ask them twice,
Right.
essentially, right? For instance, Le Pen often stood up for Field Marshal Pétain, right,
Yeah.
who led the Vichy government,
Right.
and was the great hero of World War One. But he believed, Pétain, that is, that if he didn't agree to the Nazi annexation, that the communists would take over in France,
Right.
which, by the way, was not a totally unreasonable concern. But he thought it would be better if the Nazis took over. And this actually was his opinion.
Now, this is also due in part, I suspect, because Pétain and Le Pen and people of that ilk hate Jews. And so
Also
they think,
true, yeah.
So they think the communists are the Jews, and the Nazis would be better than the communist Jews, right?
That's right. And Pétain was a military man, and the military in France was a deeply, or that was at that point, a deeply conservative, and in France, by the way, that means Catholic
Right.
organization. And they were involved very intimately in the great, that is awful episode of French anti-Semitism, the Dreyfus affair in the late 19th century, right? Dreyfus was a military officer who
Yeah,
was
Pétain would have been in
he
the
was
military
probably,
at that
he was
point.
probably
Yeah.
about the same age, right? Maybe a little younger than Dreyfus, who, by the way, after the scandal was over, served very honorably in the First World War.
All right, so just so we're clear, a guy who helped rehabilitate somebody who collaborated with the Nazis and was part of the anti-Semitic French military that led to the Dreyfus affair just died. Like Faulkner, the past isn't dead; it isn't even past.
It isn't even past. Yeah.
I mean, again, maybe it's not shocking, but it's mind-blowing.
Yes, but it ought not be, is the point
Yeah.
I'm making, right? Is that, again, many French people would prefer not to have to think about these things, but that doesn't stop them
Right.
from being true, right? There was a sort of comedy band back in New York a number of years ago, and the name of the band was Everybody Was in the French Resistance. Now, and that's that. And they did sort of accordion, funny
Sure.
music and stuff like this. But that, that's not a funny name for no reason.
Le Pen, Jean-Louis Marie Le Pen,
Yes, Jean-Marie Le Pen.
96 years
Yeah.
young.
And if the Freedom Party in Austria had ever had a leader like Le Pen before, they might have done better. They might have already been in government. Although their former leader Jörg Haider was certainly a colorful personality, but Le Pen. And of course, France is a much more important country in Europe, and especially in the European Union,
Then Austria. Yeah.
than Austria is. So even though the FPO in Austria is the OG far right party of Europe, it's Le Pen really who put the far right on the map as an up and coming concern in European politics. Because nobody really cares what happens in Austria. But if you're mounting a far right movement in France,
Yeah.
people pay attention, right? And it's something you want to know about. And all these other people, his daughter, but also Giorgia Meloni in Italy, right? Gregory Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, right? They're all following in the footsteps of Jean-Marie Le Pen. To thank for putting the far right in any position of prominence in European politics. I can't stand it, but it's a formidable political achievement and one that the significance of which will far outlast Le Pen's death.
All right. So for those of you scoring at home, Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen, dead Nazi. The Austrian far-right Freedom Party, which is now in talks to lead the government of Austria, Nazi adjacent, Nazi 2.0.
Sure, yeah.
But the head of the Canadian Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, not a Nazi, just
No.
a conservative.
That's right.
Again, I don't want to give people the impression we're just a bunch of idiot liberals who think anybody right of center is a Nazi, because
Yeah, and then there's sort of problematic figures like Giorgia Meloni, right?
Right,
Who is
in Italy.
her party, or actually in her youth, was a member of a different party that had real fascist leanings. Was a
like Mussolini fanboys.
yeah, exactly, right. But she's still very pro NATO, anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine, to the point, mind you, where European officials believe that she is the best person to be the Trump whisperer, right? That she might be able to talk him out. She was at Mar-a-Lago like a week ago. Unfortunately, that was the night before January 6th. And so the other guests at dinner were people like John Eastman and, Jeffrey Clark and some of the January 6th henchmen in the plot to overturn the election.
Sam, is this where we are? So we're saying Italian fascism might be more favorable. I mean, we're really kind of like saying, well, okay, well, the Italian fascists won't be as bad as the other ones.
No, I'm more trying to support your point in saying that Meloni might no longer actually be all that fascist, right? Because as we've discussed before, she's sort of in the near far right in Europe, right? She belongs
opposing Putin is pretty unfascist.
Yeah, she belongs to a different European far right grouping in the parliament than Marine Le Pen does. And so there are gradations of this phenomenon, is the only point I'm making. And to her credit, at the dinner at Mar-a-Lago, she was seated directly between Trump and incoming Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
I bet that was an interesting conversation.
Yeah, and I'll bet you that was Rubio's idea.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I could be wrong. That's just a guess, but that's what I think.
Yeah, put the blonde authoritarian lady next to
put the pretty
president.
lady next to him and see if she can talk him out of abandoning Ukraine. It's worth a shot.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Sam, good choices this week.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, or should we let the folks go?
I think we should let them go. I've got to make sure there's no fires breaking out anywhere
Yeah.
near us, and just to make sure. But we'll have plenty of things coming up. It'll be only a couple more weeks before Trump actually is president, and we'll have to talk about the things that he might and or might not do. Up until that point, we'll have to see what else happens. There's the Venezuelan opposition leader came out of hiding today because the incumbent president Nicolas Maduro is going to be sworn in for his next term tomorrow. So she led protests and has been arrested, apparently. It's unclear whether she's been released from detention or not. So we might want to take a look at that for next week. Apart from that, who knows what's going to happen? It's going to be some crazy thing will happen. We might want to take a look at the Chinese economy, which we haven't had occasion to talk about for a little while. Who knows?
The fasten seatbelt sign is on as we get
correct.
into 2025. All right.
Stay alive in 25, folks.
That's a good line, Sam. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. He's Sam. I'm Ramey. Peace.
Thanks, everybody.